everybody to the final lecture in the 2013 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. Thanks to everyone for attending this semester. I invite you back next spring when we have the same lecture series with a new topic, and next year we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, and so our topic in general will be looking at past, present, and future concepts and ideals of wilderness across North America and internationally. So it'll be an exciting lecture series, and hopefully many of you will come back. For students, you're able to take this course 3 times and receive credit each time for the class. So if you enjoyed it this semester, I encourage you to enroll again next spring. So tonight we have the capstone speaker in our lecture series. Dr. Reed Nost is Provost Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Central Florida, and he's president of the Florida Institute for Conservation Science. He has served as editor-in-chief of Conservation Biology and president of the Society for Conservation Biology. He's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He currently conducts research on vulnerability of species and ecosystems, in particular response to sea level rise, climate adaptation strategies, and he also works on road ecology as well. He has over 300 publications and is rated as one of the 500 most highly cited authors in all fields. His latest book is Forgotten Grasslands of the South, Natural History and Conservation. There are a few copies of his book available after the lecture tonight. So if you're interested in picking up a copy of the book, we have them here for you. The talk tonight is going to explore more on our theme that we've been talking about all semester, this idea of wilderness on the edge and the many different ways in which we not only categorize but conceptualize, study, and engage with the concept of wilderness, both in land management as well as in conceptual frameworks. So Reed's talk tonight is going to discuss wilderness as it's referred to as ecological wilderness, which are ideally areas that are large enough to be essentially self-managing, with natural disturbance regimes and intact food webs. Wilderness also, and wildness more specifically, which he will also address, refers to a quality found in natural and semi-natural areas, ranging from relatively small patches and corridors within urban landscapes, similar to what we talked about last week with Emma Maris, as well as multiple-use large landscapes. Biodiversity, the third concept that he will discuss tonight, refers to especially native species in natural patterns across landscapes, in both their patterns of abundance and distribution. And what he's going to be discussing tonight is all 3 of these: wilderness, wildness, and biodiversity, how they can best be experienced, and how they can ultimately be saved through the practice of natural history. So with that, I'd like to welcome Reed Nost to our lecture tonight.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. It's an honor and a privilege to be the capstone speaker. What Natalie didn't mention is the reason I am the capstone speaker is that she gave me a range of possible dates, and I'm from Florida, you know, and it's warm there, and I said, well, you know, I don't want to freeze to death, so I'll take the latest possible date where the chances of freezing to death are minimal, and it's been great. This weather's ideal. In fact, it's just barely warmer in Central Florida right now than it is here. We've had a really cold spring. It's great to be back in Missoula. I've been here several times. The last time was the summer of 2000 for the Society for Conservation Biology meeting. It's a great place. Y'all are lucky to be here. So the theme I'm going to develop tonight, or try to develop this evening, is that we need these things: wilderness, wildness, and biodiversity. Not only are they fundamental to effective conservation, but we also need them as individuals and as a society. So by we need, okay, this is a rather strong term, need, okay? We really need or require these things. I think the literature from the psychological fields, sociology, and so on, has shown pretty conclusively that people who spend a lot of time outdoors, especially in childhood, but also into adulthood, are smarter, they're healthier psychologically and physically. Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods, develops this theme, but there's been a lot of research since his book. It's good for us to be in wild areas. Also, and maybe ironically, nature now needs us too. Those of us who love nature, who appreciate nature, have an ethical obligation to give something back, to try to conserve nature, because in many parts of the world it's going really, really fast and the future looks a bit grim. But for that to happen, people have to be personally connected to nature. And this is another thing we get out of the social and psychological literature. And it's also something that Aldo Leopold told us back in the 30s, that we save only what we can feel, touch, and otherwise appreciate. So people need to have exposure and contact with wild places and wild things if they're going to have the will, the motivation to try to save those places and things. So when I talk about wilderness, I'm not necessarily talking about designated wilderness on federal land, although that's obviously within that category. But I'm talking about a concept that's often, well, in the past at least, has been called ecological wilderness. These are generally large areas, at least relatively large. They're roadless, or mostly so, and they're also mostly self-managing. They can take care of themselves, and they have relatively complete food webs, all the way up from plants through the herbivores to the top carnivores. This is what ecological wilderness means to me. And this concept really has a lot of precedence in this country, and surprisingly first developing in eastern North America and where I now live in Florida. Everglades National Park, okay, which was established in 1934, so 30 years before the Wilderness Act, was the first, and as far as I've been able to find, the only national park established specifically to protect an ecosystem. That's what it was all about, a functioning ecosystem with all species. So we had this idea of ecological wilderness, even though it wasn't called by that name, back in the 1930s. Ecological wilderness is also critical for many species, especially those large, wide-ranging species that require a lot of space in order to maintain viable populations, meet their life history needs. These include species like on the left, the American pronghorn. This is a family, by the way, that is distinct to North America. We've had several species of pronghorn over millions of years. They're found nowhere else in the world, this whole family. We only now have one species left. These require huge areas. In the Yellowstone ecosystem, they migrate around 341 miles each year, round trip. But about 80% of those migrations have now been lost due to development, road building, other development which has basically cut their corridors. Wolves need a lot of space, and the space varies depending on the productivity of the system. There are particular prey species, but in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as an example, a wolf pack has a territory that averages about 344 square miles. So a lot of area. This is something that ecological wilderness can provide, not many other kinds of lands can provide, at least with security in the long term. So grizzly bears, obviously, your campus mascot, fit into this category. They need very large areas, and they're sensitive then to fragmentation or splitting up of habitat on very, very broad spatial scales. So back in the 90s and early 2000s, some colleagues and students and I worked on large carnivore conservation issues, mostly in the Rockies, okay, but also in Oregon and parts of the Southwest. We focus a lot on what is now known, well, what's just starting then to be known as the Yellowstone to Yukon region. And this is illustrative of one of the spatially explicit population models that our team produced. And this modeling was mostly done by my former student, Dr. Carlos Carroll. But what this shows, okay, for grizzly bear in the Rocky Mountains of the US and Canada, it shows, based on what we know about their habitat quality, their territory size, their dispersal distance, their demography, and so on, it predicts that in green are areas where the population in an average year would grow. We call these source areas. Reproduction exceeds mortality. And they'll be sending out individuals that may colonize other areas. In pink and red, and pink's not showing up very well, but in pink and red are so-called sinks, areas where lambda, which is a measure of population growth rate, is so low that basically mortality exceeds reproduction, and the only way those populations will survive is if they receive colonists from the sources. And it shows that suitable habitat in the United States is already fragmented into these blocks: the Northern Continental Divide system, the Yellowstone ecosystem, and central Idaho, where there isn't even a resident grizzly bear population. It was extirpated and unfortunately was never able to be reintroduced, at least so far. But our modeling showed that it is suitable habitat, but again is isolated by non-habitat, which is the white area, for now a considerable distance. And the same kind of thing is starting to happen in Canada. These red sink areas, okay, have the potential to eventually start isolating these source areas. And development, of course, has increased since we did this work back in the late 90s and up to 2002. Well, this is problematic for a lot of reasons, and I think you've all probably learned in courses the importance of keystone species, of apex predators, of large herbivores, and so on in maintaining the integrity of an ecosystem. There was a recent review article on this and a book, actually. This paper by Jim Estes and all in Science, for example, shows a number of examples, which I don't have time to go into, but of systems where top consumers or large herbivores are either absent or present. And the photographs are very telling. These are the same kind of communities, but where that keystone species is either there or not there. And you can see they look very different. So certain species, and among them the top carnivores in any given food web, can be very important in structuring that entire community and shaping its appearance even. Now, probably not as appreciated, to my dismay, by modern ecologists is the importance of natural disturbances. Okay, now you've learned here in Missoula, actually you have a lot of fine work that's been done on fire ecology in particular. So you're more informed of this than most audiences. But generally I consider natural disturbance just as important as apex predators and other keystone species in maintaining ecological integrity of food webs. And a really important paper that has kind of been lost to people, it occurred in the literature before modern conservation biology was named, a paper by Pickett and Thompson that looked at the importance of natural disturbance regimes and how that scale of the natural disturbance regime influences the area of habitat we need to maintain biodiversity. And so they defined what they called a minimum dynamic area as the smallest area with a natural disturbance regime which maintains internal recolonization sources and hence minimizes extinction. Now what this means is if we lose species from these disturbed areas, okay, disturbance kills things. I mean, there's no doubt about it. A fire kills a lot of plants and animals. But it also creates new habitat opportunities. Now the recolonization sources are those undisturbed, in this case unburned areas, that can recolonize those disturbed patches. Now in some types of ecosystems like boreal forests, there are disturbance patches on the scale of 1 million acres. Now there'll be little unburned areas within those, but these disturbance patches are pretty big. So for those kinds of areas, we have to have relatively wild landscape on the scales of many millions of acres in order to accommodate these natural disturbance regimes and maintain biodiversity. So ideally, for every major ecosystem type, we would have opportunities where natural disturbances, such as lightning-caused fires, can be allowed to burn and to go out naturally as they have for time immemorial. And this was actually a rather small fire, but I really love this picture. It was taken by astronauts above or on board the International Space Station. And it shows a fire in Yellowstone National Park. It only burned 10,000 acres. It was started by lightning, okay, and then it went out on its own when the weather changed. So this is one reason why we need wilderness, so we can have this kind of thing happen, not have to spend literally billions of dollars that the government spends on fire suppression, rushing in to put in out these fires. We don't have to worry about it when we have true ecological wilderness. And there'll be bigger disturbances. Mount St. Helens, historically, looking over even the last few centuries of history, was a rather small eruption. Yet it affected, by our standards, a huge area. So we need to have large landscapes that can experience these kinds of disturbance and still have the opportunity to recover. Another critical, I think, role of large, essentially unmanaged areas, ecological wilderness, is that they potentially serve as control areas for our management experiments. I mean, we manage the hell out of the land, right? And a lot of our management experiments cover entire landscapes, big landscapes. So if we want to do this right, if we want to be good scientists, we should have wild areas that span huge landscapes as well. Now, these won't be perfect control areas from an experimental science standpoint, but they're a lot better than nothing. They're a basis for comparison. Is our management mimicking natural disturbance regime? Does it mimic the conditions that these species experienced during their evolutionary histories? Or is it having novel effects and therefore more likely to drive species to extinction? Now, one of the ironies is, however, I'm talking about large, essentially self-managing landscapes, but especially for our smaller wilderness areas, but even for some fairly large areas, there have been so many changes due to fire exclusion, now due to climate change, due to other human impacts, grazing, which of course contributes to fire exclusion, that often we need human management, such as prescribed burning, and also mechanical treatments, such as thinning in many cases, to go in and restore natural ecosystem structure, function, and composition. And a lot of people find this somewhat heretical. They don't want any management in wilderness areas. But to me, again, ecological wilderness, the point is a system that can maintain a complete food web, that can maintain wild biodiversity. To get back to that state, we need to fix what we screwed up. And so some kind of management, such as prescribed burning, can often be essential, and it may be in perpetuity, especially for the smaller areas. A small area just isn't going to experience lightning strikes often enough by chance to keep it burning regularly. So we may need to go in and set fires to maintain that natural structure. Another importance of large areas, of course, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is that they allow for population viability on very broad scales, which is important again for these very space-demanding species like large carnivores, migratory ungulates. But many times, of course, in fact, most of the time, individual conservation areas or other wild areas simply aren't big enough. So what can we do? Well, we can consider linking them by movement corridors. And the fundamental principle here is really a holistic principle. Okay, in that it suggests that a connected system of reserves, wilderness areas, other conservation areas, can be a whole greater than the sum of its parts. So although no single area might be large enough to maintain a viable population, a system or a network of well-connected, functionally connected areas might be big enough to maintain a viable population or metapopulation. And such a network might also contribute to this minimum dynamic area concept by allowing both escapes from disturbance and also recolonization of areas after disturbance. So there's been obviously, if you followed in your coursework conservation biology literature over the last decade or two, there's been a lot of emphasis on corridors and connectivity. Let me return to the state where I currently live, in Florida. Okay, in Florida, black bear were originally distributed essentially statewide. Now, because of human development, they've been fragmented into several isolated subpopulations, some of which, like this one here, are very, very tenuous. The kind of orangish-brown areas are areas with resident bear populations. The yellow are occasional bear activity, bears trying to move, for example, among areas, and in some cases succeeding. There's still some functional connectivity here. So, given this kind of knowledge, back when I was a grad student, back in the 80s, I devised a conceptual framework for a statewide network of conservation areas across Florida. Now, the real map was very detailed. It was we didn't have GIS back then, okay? So it was a paper map, a wall map, 1 to 500,000 scale, on which I put overlays, okay, to draw these corridors and core areas and buffer zones and so on. So this is a very simplistic artist's rendition of that network. Now, as you might imagine, this was perceived at the time as being somewhat radical. It actually appeared after a conference we had on the front pages of newspapers in the state. My advisor was about ready to fire me. He'd kick me out of the university. But curiously enough, within just a few years, state agencies and mainstream conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy and Florida Audubon Society were starting to kind of secretly refine my map, improve it, and use it to identify priorities for land acquisition. Because beginning around 1990, Florida was buying more land for conservation than any other state in the country. In fact, more than the federal government nationwide. This persisted for more than 2 decades. Unfortunately, it's gone now, pretty much. And so this is a recent rendition of that Florida statewide network, now called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which state agencies and others use to plan for conservation and recreation needs in Florida for the future. And in dark green are existing conservation areas, and then these priorities here, the bright green, okay, the highest first category priority based on both ecological values like biodiversity, groundwater recharge, flood protection, other ecosystem service type functions, but also recreational functions such as a wilderness trails network. And similarly, some other states now have developed similar networks, especially California, I think, provides a really good example. And again, this is no longer radical. In this case, the California Essential Habitat Connectivity Project was co-sponsored by the California Department of Transportation, California Department of Fish and Game, and the Federal Highways Administration. So this is like status quo. It amazes me because this was radical, like I said, back in the 80s to now. Today it's status quo, but it's still not really happening. These areas aren't necessarily being protected. We've got good goals, we've got good models, but we're way too slow in protecting a lot of these critical areas. And that's the downside. Furthermore, you know, if this system were put together, many large, wide-ranging species might maintain viable populations. A lot of these larger areas that are already in public ownership, the dark green, are already essentially wilderness, but a lot of the smaller areas are close to urban zones. They're never going to be wild, okay? But they do possess another quality, which wilderness has, but not just wilderness, and that's what we might call wildness. This is a quality we can find in natural and semi-natural areas, often those close to home, even within urban zones. This is one of my favorite places. I lived in Oregon for 14 years, went here a lot, just came here last summer again, took this photograph. It's a Nature Conservancy preserve on the Oregon coast. It's only a few thousand acres. It's right between a couple towns. It's not wilderness, but it's wild. I mean, from this photo, it looks like it's completely wild. You don't see the city right over the hill here or another one right behind us, okay? But it's a very important area for biodiversity and for rejuvenation of the human spirit. This is another area I hung out a lot in Oregon, right over the other side of the Cascade Mountains. This is not wilderness. This is a managed forest. This is dry-type ponderosa pine. Growth rates are very slow. The trees here are ancient because it's right in the sagebrush steppe ponderosa pine ecotone. Okay? In fact, right to the right of this photo is sagebrush and pronghorn, all right? Heavily eroded landscape, but most of the roads are accessible only to high-clearance four-wheel drive vehicles. So outside of hunting season, there's no one here. It's not wilderness, but you can go here and not see anybody all day long. And ironically, it's a lot wilder in many senses than designated wilderness with all their recreational users. So I hung out more in these kinds of areas, usually, and still do, than I do in formal conservation areas, especially wilderness and national parks, which tend to get really crowded with recreational activity. I don't like to see anybody. I'm a misanthrope. Anyway, I shouldn't admit that, perhaps. Okay, back to Florida. In Florida, we have large carnivores still. We've got, like I said, black bear. We have Florida panther, tenuous population. But we have one of the success stories of the Endangered Species Act, the American alligator. And we share landscapes, semi-natural landscapes, with these alligators. And these are large predators, very capable of killing and eating people, which they do occasionally, about one a year. But most of the time, as you can see here, this particular pond, okay, in a river, it's called Deep Hole in Myakka River State Park. This pond in the winter, when it's cold out especially, I've counted or estimated up to 600, 700 alligators in this small area. And you have to hike in, but people, bring little carts with them, like you can see here, to fish, because this place is loaded with fish, which is why the gators are there. In addition to it's spring-fed, it maintains fairly stable water temperature. And so far, gators haven't eaten anybody there. So we have we have a complete food chain pretty much. Panthers are here occasionally, not regularly, unfortunately. But it's also fairly regularly used by humans. And in Florida, we have a national scenic trail, which provides access to a lot of these wild and semi-wild landscapes. And access is important. Despite my misanthropy, I think people need to get out into nature. As I explained earlier, if we don't know these areas and love these areas, there's no hope. So I am fortunate to live around here, literally with the Florida Trail at my doorstep. I can strap on a backpack and go down to the Everglades or go to Alabama, and right from my doorstep. And most of this isn't wilderness, but most or much of it is wild, and it's very important to me and to many other people. And if we go off trail just a little bit, I have, again at my doorstep, 1.5 million acres of connected public land. It's multiple use land, mostly livestock grazing, some timber management. It's been abused in some ways, but it's wild. You can spend all day, even days out here, and never see anybody. And this is right on the edge of metropolitan Orlando, 3+ million people. I have to build up Florida because, a lot of my Western friends, even a lot of my Eastern friends, think I'm a complete fool for leaving the West and coming back to the East. Why would you do that, But most people from the West have a really bad perception of Florida. Nature is beautiful in Florida, and there's a tremendous amount of wild area. Not a lot of true wilderness outside the Everglades, but a lot of wild area and very high biodiversity. And so really, for me, the biodiversity theme, the most important reason for maintaining wild and semi-wild areas is to provide habitat for species many of which are sensitive to human activity. Venomous snakes. People kill venomous snakes on sight almost everywhere in the world. So you have to have fairly inaccessible, large, wild areas to maintain populations of many of these species. So I've kind of come full circle in my own career where I'm back to my roots, to a large extent, studying natural history. And I've really come to the conclusion that the study of natural history is the key, or at least a key, to appreciating wildness and biodiversity, and thereby coming up with the will to protect it. So I see the process as working something like this. It certainly has in my lifetime and that of many of my friends and colleagues. We spend time in nature, going back to childhood. Unless you have serious psychological problems, if you spend a lot of time in nature, you're going to develop an aesthetic appreciation for these areas and kind of a visceral connection to wild things. You'll start to develop wonder, a sense of wonder and curiosity about nature. You'll try to seek more knowledge about nature, like what is that plant I saw the other day, that really beautiful wildflower, or that huge tree. For some of us, we'll formally study nature, but even if we don't, we'll start to develop, with knowledge and time in nature, increasing respect and affection for nature. Now this means, though, that we're going to be more and more offended and pissed off when we see destruction of nature. I'm sure many of you can relate to this. It's kind of the double-edged sword. Like Ada Leopold said, the penalty of an ecological education is to live alone in a world of wounds. To live alone in a world of wounds. That means other people don't even see it. The people that see the wounds are those who love and appreciate nature. But that's a good thing, because we're the ones who are going to defend it. And so we'll take action of various kinds to avoid that destruction, whether it's teachers, whatever. But to avoid burnout, we better spend more time in nature. I've met a lot of environmental activists over my career who never go outside, and I just don't get it. the rationale as well, I'm busy with the real work. I'm on the Hill, I'm lobbying, I'm writing letters, I don't have time to go out hiking. Well, I think this is a subterfuge. If you don't have time to go out hiking, you're not really that interested in nature. You better make the time because it will rejuvenate you and make you more productive and more effective in your career as a conservationist. So natural history then, I think, contributes directly and indirectly to conservation. We've all, in conservation biology, used these doom and gloom arguments, the 6 max extinction and so on. These are almost certainly accurate, but they're poor motivators. I mean, who wants to go out there and fight, based on knowledge that everything is going to hell, The ecosystem services argument, which is currently very popular in conservation, all the big-time mainstream conservation groups have latched onto this. In fact, it's a very poor motivator. I've found, and the literature suggests this, people don't understand what it means. They're not invigorated by it. It's boring. Ecosystem services are real, but they're boring. And it's kind of ironic. There was a major poll by the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the mainstream groups that has really latched on to the ecosystem, or jumped onto the ecosystem services bandwagon, I should say. They conducted this large poll, but haven't publicized it at all. The poll was done just a couple of years ago. Because it showed that actually they are more interested in nature's value, both for instrumental and for intrinsic value reasons, not for solely what nature does for us. And I think, natural history is inherently interesting. It's this biophilia idea that E.O. Wilson promoted. And if you expose people to it, they'll want to do something to protect nature. I found this, a population of this narrow endemic plant right near my home, which for us naturalists is a really exciting thing. Beautiful flower, celestial lily. But what is natural history? I mean, what distinguishes natural history, say, from the ecology courses you're taking in college? Well, for one thing, it's not just acceptance of observation, okay, as a complement to experimentation. It's not just its rejection of extreme reductionism and hyperspecialization, or that much of it must be learned outdoors. All of these are true, but I think more fundamentally, natural history requires and insists on intimate familiarity with some aspect of nature, of biodiversity. And some people are extreme specialists. They might study a single genus of fly for their entire career, but they know everything about that genus of fly. Those people are very important, as are the generalists who for any given region can go out and tell you not only the name of everything, but its role in the system, its life history. And some people, the really remarkable people, are both. They have a specialty, but also they're general naturalists. And these are the people I admire most. So by knowing nature intimately, we learn what it might take to keep species and communities going through rough times. And we're in rough times, people. You all know that. The more we know about these species, about their life histories, their niche requirements, whatever we want to call them, the better job we'll do developing conservation plans for biodiversity generally. A lot of people think sparrows are kind of boring, ugly little creatures, but look at this close-up of a Henslow sparrow. They're beautiful. Every sparrow is beautiful. So, importantly, going back, I mentioned Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods. Children don't get outdoors much anymore. So where's our next generation of defenders of nature? Where's our next generation of naturalists? Well, unfortunately, it's looking to be pretty small. So I think that teaching children about natural history is an ethical obligation of parents, of grandparents, as in the case here, of teachers, and all other adults. Biodiversity will only be saved when there's a critical mass of people who are motivated to save it, including future generations. Well, the final theme I want to develop here in this talk is an idea that has occurred to me over the years, and I had time to develop it some during the writing of this recent book. Which idea that, wildness is not just a spatial thing. We tend to think about wilderness as big areas, but wilderness is also temporal. temporal. There's a wilderness of time. Every place has a history which is largely wild. Now, sometimes this has been called deep history, and it involves, the evolutionary unfolding of a place and its inhabitants over thousands and even millions of years. I mean, think about it. Anywhere in the world, virtually, has been wilderness for 99.999999% of its entire history. Well, that means something. And I think this is a point we need to make to those people that say wilderness doesn't exist, it's not important. Hell, it's shaped the evolutionary history of everything out there. Now, not that humans haven't had an impact, but our impact is relatively recent compared to that of other forces of nature. It's overwhelming, but I am not ready to throw in the towel and call this the Anthropocene. Other processes have been in place a lot longer and are very, very relevant to the biodiversity we find today. So my interest in endangered ecosystems, those that are in steep decline and heavily threatened, and their deep histories inspired this book project. And I consider the origin and historical development of grasslands in the southeastern United States as lessons for their conservation and also their restoration and management. And as you might expect, this book is not just about grasslands. It's really a statement of my philosophy of conservation. A lot of people are surprised to know, even many ecologists within the South are surprised to know that much or even most of the southeastern United States was grassland prior to European settlement. And we still have extensive grasslands. This is just one example, the Florida dry prairie, okay? Historically about 1.2 million acres based on early survey maps, General Land Survey Office, for example. It's declined by about 90%, but there's still some big chunks. This one state park where this photo was taken has dry prairie on the order of tens of thousands of acres. This is an ecosystem endemic to Florida, and it houses an endemic subspecies of bird, the Florida grasshopper sparrow, probably the most highly imperiled bird in continental North America. In fact, the entire coastal plain of the South, okay, was dominated by a type of grassland, the longleaf pine savanna. This was the matrix vegetation of the region in which other types of communities were embedded. This is what it looks like. This is an example. We do have some remnants. About 97% or more, actually more now, has been lost. But beautiful remnants like the green, so-called green swamp, most of which is not at all swamp in North Carolina. It's really a shrub bog or pocosin with islands of longleaf pine savanna. This is one of the most biodiverse systems for plants on Earth. This particular site that we're in right here when I took this photo has had measured species richness of vascular plants of 50 species per meter squared. It's like a record worldwide, okay? Really cool. Now, I can't identify most of them. I mean, thank goodness for botanists. But I can appreciate that this is a beautiful place, and it's a grassland, okay? We might call this a forest, but the biomass, the biodiversity is in the grass-dominated ground cover. Now, some people have asserted that the longleaf pine community is a human-created ecosystem. It was created by the Indians that came into the region and started burning, and they created this fire-dependent grassland savanna system over this huge area. Well, unfortunately, we have a pollen record. Fortunately for these people who argue this, we have a pollen record, especially in peninsular Florida, that is virtually unsurpassed worldwide. Okay, we have a continuous pollen record from this one site, Lake Tulane, which goes back 62,000 years. And so people who have argued for longleaf pine being an anthropogenic ecosystem based on the fact that earlier pollen records had showed this big increase over the last, 15,000 years. Okay, and humans first came into the area maybe about 15,000 years ago at longest. The earliest positive archaeological evidence we have is about 13,000 or so. So you can see since that time, steady increase in pine. But go back, we've had these cycles of pine dominance compared to oak dominance. The grasses, Poaceae, okay, has actually been more abundant during the oak cycles than during the pine cycles. Even though we know they're part of the longleaf pine grassland, Current thinking is leading towards an idea that these oak-dominated system, the oaks were not trees. We have these oaks in Florida that are only a few inches tall. And in the Florida dry prairie, for example, one of the dominant plants is Quercus minima, dwarf oak, that only gets a few inches tall, carries out its entire lifespan, lets out tons of pollen. This could explain this cycle completely. No need to invoke human activity in this cycle. And savanna condition goes back much further than the Pleistocene. Here's a reconstruction based on plant and animal fossils, okay, from a site from the early Miocene, about 18 million years ago. Look at this scene. If you're familiar with the Southeast at all, or thinking back to that photo I just showed you, the green swamp, this is very reminiscent of what we see today in natural areas that still have longleaf pine system. Only at that time we had mega herbivores like horses, and rhinos and camels and mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths, giant tortoises larger than Galapagos tortoises, pronghorns, etc., etc. But there's a lot of misconceptions about grasslands. These are from a couple recent books that I really like, actually, so I kind of hate to cite them in an unfavorable light. One excellent little field guide on butterflies, okay, states that there are no true prairies in the East today. The Florida dry prairie, which I just showed you, is technically neither a prairie nor a grassland. Well, the plants and animals there might disagree with that statement, because they are grassland plants and animals. Another statement by an anthropologist, Kat Anderson, in another wonderful book, California Grasslands, most, if not all, of the great grasslands of the world, from the Serengeti Plains to the prairie bioregion of the contiguous United States, were maintained with fires set by native people. And in fact, I've heard Kat Anderson in person say that all grasslands were created by native people. Unfortunately, this does not jibe very well with the pollen data and other fossil evidence that grasslands go back many millions of years in North America and elsewhere. Now, back in 1992, there was an article by a geographer, Bill Denovan, called The Pristine Myth, that asserted that North America was not wilderness. Okay, you've all heard this argument, probably in this lecture series. But rather, it was a heavily peopled landscape, and the vegetation virtually everywhere was basically strongly affected and shaped by human activity. And one of the latest takes on this in book form is a 2005 book by a journalist, Charles Mann, called 1491, which purports to describe the landscape prior to the arrival of the first Europeans. And this is kind of an excerpt of a map he showed of human activity in the Americas, where I zoomed in on eastern North America. And you can see he showed, in dark gray, areas dominated by anthropogenic fire, and then in light gray, widespread forest clearing for agriculture. Now, no doubt there was forest clearing for agriculture. Widespread, however, no evidence. Dominated by anthropogenic fire. Okay, focusing just on the Florida Peninsula, okay, I've read the early Spanish accounts, the first Spanish that crossed or traveled the length of the peninsula. Very sparse human populations. They had small agricultural plots. They were hunter-gatherers. They may have used fire, but the European explorers in the peninsula did not note that. Not until they got up here into the panhandle that they find these huge agricultural fields, a large chiefdom known as Appalachia, and widespread use of fire. And this also occurred elsewhere in the coastal plain. But most of this map is frankly pure fiction. We know from dendrochronological evidence, for example, fire scars from really old stumps or really old remaining longleaf pines. Longleaf pines get up to over 500 years old. That the fires occurred primarily during the growing season, but ethnographic evidence shows that Indians burned, and the white settlers after them, they burned in the fall, late fall, in the winter. Okay, so these were not human-set fires, they were lightning fires that occurred. And look at this. Okay, so Charles Mann in his book says that only in the Rocky Mountains is there enough lightning and enough lightning fire to really maintain natural fire systems. Well, he didn't look into the data. He just kind of made up a story to suit his preference. In fact, lightning flash frequency, lightning strikes, and lightning fires are by far more abundant in Florida and the Gulf Coast than anywhere else in North America. And you can't see it, but there's a little spot here of violet and another one here of the very highest frequency, 16 flashes per square kilometer per year. I overlaid this map on a map of Florida, and this spot here occurs literally right over my house. I'm serious. And I've had several trees killed by lightning since I've lived there in the last 11 years, which is really cool, I think. I love lightning. But in any case, I mean, it's, natural scientists do this too. People sometimes make up data, make up stories to fit some preconceived notion. That's not right. I don't care what side it's on. Get the data. Tell the truth. Be willing to throw aside your preconceived notions. All right? This is where the lightning occurred, okay, primarily. Obviously, lightning fire is important in the Rockies. You all know that. But you can tell by this map that it was even more important in the Southeast. Another bit of counter evidence to Charles Mann and Bill Denovan and Kat Anderson and others, endemism. Endemic, narrowly endemic plants and animals restricted to very small areas, actually very, very high in the southeastern coastal plain. And for plants, as shown here, most of these centers of endemism are in grassland ecosystems, longleaf pine and other grassland systems. These endemics take a while to evolve. I mean, they didn't just get there since humans arrived. So this extreme degree of evidence that we see in southeastern grasslands provides evidence of antiquity. Supports the argument that many of these grasslands, at least, were created and maintained by natural processes, such as climate change and lightning-ignited fire, rather than by human activity, which did not begin in the South until, at the most, 14,000 or 15,000 years ago. And I've showed you other evidence, fossil evidence, that says the same thing. I've been talking about endemics last couple slides. That's who but a biology nerd would care about endemics. Well, amazingly enough, at least one study conducted in British Columbia, this Muser et al. Paper, found that of all species attributes, endemism was most important to people. Of course, they didn't use the term endemism. They used the term, a species that is found only in British Columbia or only in part of British Columbia. That's what mattered most to the people. Because that's something you can be proud of. Hey, we've got the Vancouver Island marmot. It doesn't occur anywhere else but in British Columbia, Vancouver Island. This is really cool. People can relate to that, amazingly enough. This was a poll of the general public. And so I live for the day when people in Florida, who are mostly Yankees who don't know or care anything about the natural history, will say, for example, of this species, this is our mouse. The only species in its genus, all right, and found nowhere else but in Florida. We will not let developers pave over its habitat. Now, they're not saying that yet because they're Yankees and they've never heard of the Florida mouse. Okay, disjunct species. Maybe you've learned about disjunctions in biogeography class or other classes, all right? These also tell a story of ancient history anywhere, really, okay? This is a really cool example, if you'll bear with me a moment here. This is a grass of short grass prairie and desert grasslands. Hairy grama, Butylil hirsuta, all right? But here it is, the dominant plant in a subtropical island off the southwest coast of Florida. Now, what is this arid-adapted, short grass doing in a humid subtropical island off Florida? Of course, we don't really know. There's no direct evidence, but it seems that it was probably once connected by a continuous swath of grassland all the way to the southwest in the Great Plains. And there's other evidence for that. All these taxa here are found in the southeast and have populations of the same or closely related species in the arid or semi-arid west. Tortoises. Okay, we have one species in the southeast, 3 or 4 in the southwest and Mexico. So these 3 birds, classic, western sagebrush steppe grassland birds, we've got disjunct populations in Florida. Seems weird. They're separated by 1,000 or more miles from the nearest population to the west. Diamondback rattlesnakes, we've got the eastern, the west has the western. Bees, ignumid wasps, harvester ants. You all know harvester ants. You go out in the desert or sagebrush steppe. We have 21 species of Pogonomyrmex, harvester ants, in the west that are still extant, still alive today. We have one species, the Florida harvester ant, in the southeast. sure suggests maybe they were connected at one time. And then all these others. And also many that are now totally gone from the southeast or extinct overall, like jackrabbits we had in Florida and much of the southeast. Pronghorns and their predators, the cheetah, which pronghorns can run as fast as cheetah, by the way. Ground squirrels, pallid bat, condors, teratorns, prairie chickens, and on and on. Now these disjunct patterns are probably best explained by what paleontologist David Webb called the Gulf Coastal Corridor, which connected the southeastern U.S., especially Florida, to this arid and semi-arid west. And much of Florida and other sandy habitat in the southeast is ecologically a desert because they're deep sands. Okay, so it's a very xeric habitat despite abundant rainfall. So these arid adapted species were able to persist. And during times of low sea level, like full glacial, okay, full glacial period, coastline was all the way out to the continental shelf. So Florida was much closer to Texas, much closer to the Yucatan, which we also share many species with. There were also times in the past when grassland expanded into various parts of North America. And Edgar Transeau showed this back in a paper in 1935, that during the hypsothermal, which was around 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, he hypothesized grassland spread from the Great Plains, this was a dry period, into the east, with outliers in Ohio, and in fact some all the way to the east coast. There's a grassland on Long Island, which now is down to a few acres. It was once about 30,000 acres, which was essentially tall grass prairie. It was called the Hempstead Plains grassland. All right? And Transeau hypothesized that grasslands persist here because of summer drought. And if summer drought were to relax, then forests would overtake these sites, but if it were to intensify, then grasslands would expand. Now, in addition to climate and fire, here's the other factor I think is really critical, one of the other factors, there's actually several, for the origin and maintenance of grasslands in the southeast, large herbivores. I've already alluded to the fact we had large herbivores in the southeast, like you had here in Montana and most of the rest of North America. And these creatures not only ate trees and grazed on grasses, but they actively destroyed trees to maintain an open savanna environment that favored them. This is what African elephants do today in Africa, okay? And we know from the adaptations of some of these early species, inferred from their skeletal remains, that they probably did the same thing. So the savannas, the longleaf pine savannas of the Pleistocene and earlier were probably much more open, fewer trees than when the first white settlers or the first Indians even got here. An interesting case are the grassy balds of the southern Appalachians. And by the way, these have an analog to the so-called grass balds of the Oregon Coast Range. Anybody from Oregon or know Oregon? There's grass balds in the Oregon Coast Range. The largest one is on Mary's Peak outside Corvallis, which appear to have the same origin. These probably arose during the Pleistocene when they were grassy tundra, essentially. But what maintained them? Why didn't they disappear when the climate warmed up? Well, one hypothesis is large herbivores. And this has been called the chain of herbivores hypothesis, now rephrased as the climate herbivores hypothesis. And it suggests that mega herbivores of the Pleistocene moved up during the summer, perhaps, even during the Pleistocene glacial maximum, but at least after the glacial maximum, moved up in the summer to graze this grassy tundra area. We know these animals undertook seasonal migrations elsewhere, okay? And there's some 20 species documented in that region. Now, they went extinct about 13,000 years ago, probably due to a combination of climate and human hunting. Hunting probably being the major factor for most of them. But not all of them went extinct. We still had bison, elk, and deer. But then the white settlers came in and wiped out the bison, the elk, and even the deer. It's hard to imagine that white-tailed deer, an overabundant species across the east now, was actually extinct in most eastern states. Had to be reintroduced due to overhunting from the early white settlers. They were already knocked way back by the Indians for the deerskin trade, okay, because the white settlers paid the Indians to shoot as many deer as they could and deliver deerskins. In any case, so these were wiped out, but we know, we have good evidence, even photos and so on, showing that the white settlers moved their livestock in the summer up onto these balds to graze, because there's all this abundant grassy habitat. And we know that when those livestock were removed, in large part with the goal of restoring these grassy balds to natural condition, that the balds have started closing in with trees. So now there's some experiments reintroducing livestock to see what their role is in maintaining these clades. But we know they're ancient. There's endemic taxa that are only found in these balds. And I think this chain of herbivores hypothesis, or something like it, can be extended much further, maybe to many places in North America. But I found that throughout the South, there are these rich sites, often salt licks, where animals congregated, got stuck in this muck, died, and we later found their bones. And this humorous-sounding place called Big Bone Lick in Kentucky has been called the birthplace of North American vertebrate paleontology, yielding more species of Pleistocene mega-herbivore and some carnivores as well than anywhere else. These animals congregated here, but this was connected to other salt licks and favorable habitats by a series of wide trails, which came to be known as buffalo traces, because when the white settlers came here, herds of buffalo were using those trails. But they were almost certainly created earlier. Here's one of the few surviving buffalo traces. Most are now roads. Why do you think they're roads? They were the paths of least resistance through the landscape. I mean, we're no different than a mammoth. We're not going to go over and up and over ridge and up and down ridges. We're going to follow the path of least resistance. So most are gone. We have this place left, and really cool, there are some species that are adapted to these heavily grazed, heavily trampled buffalo traces. This species, one of the rarest plants in the world, was discovered at the Falls of the Ohio, which is where one of these buffalo traces crosses the Ohio River. It was a shallow area, hence the falls. It was a riffle, really. Well, then the predecessor of the Corps of Engineers built a dam and drowned out that population, and it was thought to be extinct. Then it was rediscovered a century later at this site, okay, along an old buffalo trace, but this area was now being heavily grazed by livestock. So this plant is evidently a poor competitor. It required this intense activity of grazing and trampling and just overall, rowdiness of large herbivores to maintain favorable habitat. And we have reintroduced bison into some parts of the east, like elsewhere, but they're not in large self-sustaining populations. They're not interacting with fire, a relationship that some have called pyrrhic herbivory, which actually has been shown in tallgrass prairie to maximize biodiversity compared to either herbivory alone or fire alone. Probably the same thing true for the south, for this part of the country, and elsewhere. The interaction of disturbance events, very important for biodiversity. So to conclude, I've argued that wildness, wilderness, and biodiversity are fundamental for the integrity of nature and for the integrity of the human spirit. We need these things. Don't write them off and say, oh, the world, we're in the Anthropocene, we don't need this anymore. It's all human-created ecosystems today. These things, these places out there have rich histories. These species have rich histories that far predate human activity. We need to recognize that. And maybe most important, in closing, we need to promote within ourselves and foster in others a sense of wonder about nature. When Rachel Carson died, she had an unfinished manuscript titled A Sense of Wonder. And it was finally published a year after her death, even though it was incomplete. But it's a very profound paper. And basically, I think the lesson for us is that wonder, fascination, joy, awe that we can find in nature are much better motivators for conservation action than fear or despair. So getting out there in nature, studying natural history, in my book, that's the way to become an effective conservationist and a happy person. Thank you. Yes.
I got here a little late, so I apologize. We've already talked about this, but you have not. Could you comment on the nature use path initiative?
Oh, the nature needs half. Okay, this is the idea that Harvey Locke is one of the main promoters of this, and he's suggesting that the science in general supports the view that of an average region, to maintain functional, complete food webs, about, on average, half of the landscape needs to be in a relatively wild condition. Now, it does vary a lot from region to region. Okay, areas that are very heterogeneous, that have high endemism, that have very large-scale disturbance regimes, tend to need more area than regions that are more homogeneous. So it does vary a lot. It might vary from 10% to 90%. But I think, in general, the literature supports the view that on average about half of the landscape should be kept, not necessarily as designated wilderness, but as land wild enough to support native biodiversity. And that's a lot more than we have now, right? We have now a little over 12% globally of land area that's in some kind of conservation area. So it's a start. Other questions? Want to ask me any questions about grassland endemics or anything like that? Okay, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's like really slow recovery for species in protected areas, and I was wondering if you could, talk a little bit more about that, why the recovery is slow, and kind of point out the obstacles that are, preventing that.
Okay, the question was about why recovery of species in conservation areas is slow. I didn't mean to imply that as a general statement. It really varies a lot by species and how the area is managed and so on. But what I was referring to, I think, that you're noting here is a lot of areas that the disturbance regime has been dramatically altered by human activity. Okay, whether it's natural flooding that has been altered by dams, or fire that's been excluded actively or passively by fuel breaks such as highways that prevent, except for under extreme events, the natural spread of fire. So we've altered the landscape so much that those areas aren't necessarily going to recover on their own, that we need to go in. If we want a so-called natural condition, we have to paradoxically go in and actually manage those systems to bring them back to some condition that approximates the conditions under which species in that ecosystem evolve. And that's really what it's all about. What type of conditions do the species that are found there, what did they experience during their evolutionary histories? If what we have now is radically different from their experience, then chances are we're going to lose some of them. So the best that we can approximate the range of variation within their evolutionary history, the lower the extinction rate, all else being equal. So that's what I meant. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I wasn't quite clear on your distinction between wilderness and wildness. If I understood your wilderness, we're talking about ecologically self-sustaining, but I think of that self-sustaining aspect as being essential to wildness. So how are you using wildness differently than wilderness?
Okay, wildness versus wilderness. It's a continuum. Okay, so on the far end of the continuum where you have basically self-managing, self-sustaining ecosystems with complete food webs, this is what I would call ecological wilderness. Although, as I just noted, some of these may still require some restoration if they've been messed up. However, there are a lot of landscapes that have a lot of roads, that are small patches, that are even within urban areas, that still maintain most of their native species, and where you can still go and not see anybody. Like I showed some examples from Florida, and they're wild. They're not true wilderness, but they're wild. And both for the species that live there and for the human experience, they're incredibly important. Because most people are going to be more in those semi-natural wild areas than they are in absolute pristine wilderness. So it's really, they overlap, the concepts are overlapping, but wilderness is kind of the purest end of the spectrum, to me. Yes?
Think about introducing pest snakes to places like the Everglades. That might change the ecosystem. Do you think that's like a good thing?
Bad thing to release pet snakes in the Everglades. We now, as some of you may know, we have, we don't really know because they're so hard to find, but upwards of 100,000 Burmese pythons, self-sustaining wild population in the Everglades. And there was a recent study, which was observational based on roadside surveys through Everglades National Park, which suggests declines of various mammal species, medium-sized to large mammal species, exceeding 90% since Burmese pythons were introduced. So they're having a huge impact. And in its native habitat, Burmese pythons even eat jaguars, so they could potentially eat Florida panthers, and they're certainly eating Florida panther prey. Unfortunately, you know, I was just telling my friends and colleagues at dinner about this. Our state wildlife agency, like many such agencies, is more of a PR agency in some ways than a real management agency. But they decided, well, we can take care of this. We'll just get more hunting down there. We'll promote a big hunt of the pythons in Everglades National Park and kill all these snakes. So they paid people from around the country to come down and participate in this hunt. And the people that killed the biggest snakes or the most snakes got these big prizes. Well, and I think it was a week long or 10 days or something of this hunt. Out of, again, 100,000 plus pythons, they killed 50. I mean, it's not, there's no way. You can't find these snakes. The Everglades is a big place. There's no roads, or very few. So, I mean, this is going to have long-lasting impacts. I mean, probably in the very long term, this is what's great about nature. In the long term, nature bats last. I used to have a bumper sticker to that effect. I mean, no matter what we do, over millions of years, it'll all be erased by evolution. We'll be gone, most likely. But in the short term, we need to figure out something. And you know, I think maybe within a century or two, there'll be some adjustment where something will learn that these baby pythons are really good to eat, and maybe less time. And it may be a self-correcting system. Nature tends to do that. But in the meantime, yeah, the snakes are having a huge impact. Yes?
I want to explore this idea of sort of managing wilderness or manipulating wilderness. And I'm thinking more along the context of what we consider designated wilderness in order to restore conditions, restore natural conditions or whatever. And I ask the question in the context of believing that we can't ever go back. With climate change, with the number of extirpated species that are out there, I mean, aren't we really talking about just converting these places to something else that we find desirable rather than trusting nature, for example? And don't we run the risk, as you just gave the example of the pythons, where maybe nature will find a way to deal with the pythons, but since we're in there meddling all the time, we're probably interfering in that process as well. So how do you decide whether we ought to be in there mucking around in these places or not?
That's, I don't know if y'all heard it. That was a very good question. It's something I think about all the time. I've been an advocate of management within wilderness for a long time and got a lot of disagreement from many of my colleagues and friends about this. I try to avoid, you know, the philosophical argument and just look at what can we do that's going to minimize loss of biodiversity. It's going to minimize risk of extinction. And I agree with you that we can't go home again. We're never going to get back to some pristine system, you know, before Europeans got here. And with climate change, that's not really realistic anyway for most landscapes. Although, again, like I showed examples from the southeast, some of these systems have persisted relatively unchanged for millions of years. They've fluctuated in dominance, but they've been basically the same system for tens of millions of years, which is amazing. So what my philosophy is, you know, we try to implement restoration to the point where we get it to where it is within that range of variability that the species there have experienced, like I mentioned, during their evolutionary histories. What, you know, the best guess that we can make of that. And in systems that were characterized by, say, frequent low severity ground fire, that might require some mechanical thinning as well as prescribed fire. And then maybe if the area is big enough, lightning can take care of it. Because in ponderosa pine systems, for example, like the longleaf pine that I illustrated, most of the biodiversity is in the herbaceous layer. And so with fire exclusion, which is a human thing, it's something that we've done, we've reduced biodiversity. And to try to get some of that back, even though it's not going to be the same system. It's going to be a richer system than if we didn't go in there and do anything. So that's my philosophy. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. And so in any individual case, and I've been on many scientific panels where we've grappled with that kind of question, what kind of management is appropriate? And it turns out to be a very site-specific, in some case species-specific type of question. If there's an endangered species, it's really declined, and it requires that we go in there and do some restoration, then I think we should do it. If we're the ones that screwed things up in the first place, which is usually the case. Yes?
What's your response to those that would argue that we need to facilitate the migration of species into congressionally designated wildernesses in response to anticipated consequences as a result of climate change?
Okay, the question was about actually moving species into wilderness or other conservation areas?
Typically that are not there.
Yes, that are not there now. That is a very controversial issue in conservation biology right now. It's been called assisted migration, assisted colonization, managed translocation, all kinds of things. It carries risk. We know what happens when you introduce a species into an area where it has not been. However, I think it can be justified. If we have good evidence that the species was there during past periods of climate that are similar to what we're approaching now, but that human-made barriers stand in the way of them getting there, I think that's a pretty powerful argument that we ought to help them get there, because they're likely, some of them, to go extinct in the areas they're currently located. In Florida, I'm working on a sea level rise impacts project and developing some adaptation options. And there we have areas, coastal areas, like that one coastal grassland I showed you with a lot of rare species. Well, they're either because they're on an island or else they're in a coastal area that's cut off from other natural habitat by, highways. And, if you've ever been in a beach in Florida, most places, it's urban, Not everywhere, fortunately. Again, Florida gets a bad rap because people tend to go to Florida and see the ugliest places from a wilderness perspective. But my point is, they can't get to where they need to go, even on a fairly short distance. I mean, even a mile, because there's a highway and a city in the way. So managed translocation in those cases, if suitable habitat lies landward of those barriers, makes a lot of sense. And I know we're going to end up recommending that for a number of species based on our study.
So looking for your bright line in the sand, you argued in your presentation that we've manipulated in a lot of places and we've kind of screwed it up. So we need to protect some areas because we're not really good at guessing and getting it right. So I'm trying to figure out, on one hand, that's what you're arguing. On the other hand, you're suggesting, yes, we need to go manipulate and put species into areas.
Well, it's not a black and white issue. It's an area, it's again, a type of question that needs to be asked case by case. There's no general answer. There's some cases where more intensive human management is needed. There's other cases where we know that the human tendency to over-manipulate has just screwed up the system more. And that would include moving species around. So I think we need to keep it in the toolbox of conservation options, but be very cautious in applying assisted migration because there are risks. And again, I would apply it only where we have strong evidence that it's been there in the past under previous climates that are similar to what we project, and it would probably get there on its own were it not for all these human barriers we put into the way. But good question. I mean, another one that's very controversial. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is basically a cultural question because you're so far on the answer. The Fish Wildlife Park out there, general populace, how do they dictate decisions? Is there a basic understanding of the cascading of the keystone predators and the river and so on down? Do they make their decisions down there with some reasonable effort to have coexistence with keystone species, or do they base their decisions on politics instead of science like we tend to have?
Good question. It's not that much different from the West. You know, Florida, as most of you probably know, it's the only place in the East that has native mountain lions, cougar, puma, still existing. And the only reason they persisted in South Florida is because it was the most roadless, inaccessible part of the entire eastern U.S. It was the last place to be settled. Most of South Florida wasn't settled at all until after 1890. And so that's why panthers are there. Now, the recovery plan for the panther, going back more than 2 decades, has called for reestablishment of panther populations not only elsewhere in Florida, but throughout the southeast, because the Florida panther is a misnomer. It was a southeastern panther, and it was contiguous with other subspecies which aren't even recognized anymore. The latest genetic studies show that all North American cougar are a single subspecies. All right, so from a biological standpoint, not only from the genetic argument, but from an ecological keystone species argument, yeah, we need to reintroduce these cats all over the place. But despite the recovery plan calling for that, we've not introduced a single panther outside of South Florida. Now, the males will cross these channelized rivers we have. They'll cross interstate highways, and they do. We had a panther killed near Atlanta a couple of years ago. Genetic tests showed it was from the big cypress population of South Florida. We have male panthers. I have one right near my house. I found the tracks. It was shot by somebody a couple of weeks later along a road. So politically, we can't get there. Females will not cross those barriers. Males will. And so you've got to actively move females to new places along with males if they're further away. And we're having the same problem doing it, or worse, than with the reintroduction of the wolf in the West. Yes?
How do we reach a balance between wilderness, wildness, biodiversity, and biodiversity, agriculture, population growth? What's the balance? What's all of them?
What's the balance between wilderness, wildness, biodiversity, and human population? Well, you know, looking from, as a biologist and valuing biodiversity, we're already way into overshoot mode. You know, we define as ecologists carrying capacity as the population that is sustainable without wrecking the environment. Now, we've kind of artificially raised our carrying capacity through technology, and technological optimists assume we can keep doing that forever. But ecologists know that exponential growth forever is impossible. And history shows that every population that's done that has collapsed. So we're way over. I mean, we've got to get check on not only human population growth, but economic growth. Now, those aren't popular things to say outside of a room full of biologists and conservationists, maybe. So I don't know if we can ever do it. I mean, most likely we're going to crash. Nature will take care of it for us. So I think we're way over the point of any reasonable balance, personally. And that, you know, if I were president, I'd have to be more than president. I'd have to be president and Congress and Supreme Court. I would say give people a tax break to have no children or one child. No break or penalty if you have 2 children, because that's a little below replacement rate. 3 children on up, exponentially increasing tax rate. Because population growth is exponential, so should your taxes if you have 3 or more kids. That would take care of things, I think, pretty damn quick. But is it going to happen? I mean, probably not anytime soon, but I keep arguing for it. And I'm not the only one. There are a few other wackos that argue for that. But yeah, we're out of balance. Yes, sir.
Educator, I just keep looking at this kid on this picture, and I'm sitting.
My grandson.
Is it?
Yes.
And I'm thinking about his sense of wonder, and I'm also an educator, and I think about the sense of wonder and how I feel as part of both of our crusades to get, but their sense of wonder has moved from the natural world to technology, to lots of commercial pressures and market pressures and educational pressures for those kids to understand technology to be able to be competitive. And I find that, you know, that value system that at one time for us was our freedom to get out of the house and go explore they explore different regions. And we had one speaker that talked about that at the beginning of the year between the digital and the, I thought that was really interesting to think about those two places that we find wonder in, and how, you know, we're kind of getting outspent, like in some politicians.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm concerned about that as an aging educator, and finding that, you know, and as more kids come in, their background knowledges are just so much lower and lower and lower.
You're absolutely right.
No, I've never seen that.
Well, Richard Louv, again, he called this problem, you know, nature deficit disorder, where we're seeing serious psychological and physical ailments in kids who aren't getting enough nature and they're getting too much technology. ADD, ADHD, yeah. But you know, I think it's a failure of parents and of the educational system. I'm not going to point my finger at any given parent, but I mean, my kids and grandkids get outside. They appreciate nature. That's all I can say. I mean, and I'm not going to brag about it, but they didn't always want to go. You know, we forced them to go. But sure enough, they learned to love it. You know? But, you know, I know a lot of parents, you know, friends of mine who are just, oh, you know, they don't want to be authoritarian. Because we tend to be, you know, people and conservationists tend to be progressives and liberal and have a lot of tolerance. So, you know, we don't want to tell our kids what to do. If they want to play a video game, they want to watch TV, they can do it. But I say, no, don't let them. Shoot the TV. Yeah. We didn't have TV when my kids were little. Yeah, we just don't let them. You know, we force them to go camp in the desert. You know, and they love it.
How old are your kids?
My kids are, I have 3, so I should be taxed. They're 32, 23, and 20. And I have grandkids 5 and 1. So, but they're all into it, you know. Only one professionally, but the others, you know, my daughter rebelled the most, okay? For a while, she just simply refused to go with us. We go hiking, she'd sit in the trail and not come, you know, and just really rebelled. And she ended up marrying a biologist, and that's all they do is go backpacking and canoeing. So they come back to where they came from. Thanks for that question, though. Okay, we've gone on a ways, so I appreciate your tenacity. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks very much.